today's talk. This talk is based on my book, On to the Grave, because a number of years ago, I just became obsessed with the many, many ways in which death had changed in the Ozarks. And that so many of these things came as a surprise to me, that there had been a time before the professional funeral industry where every part of the process was done by the neighbors, the friends, the lodge fellows, the family, and that no one was spared from this process. Even children were expected to participate. So I'm going to walk us through what would have happened in a pretty typical death in the Ozarks. I want to say 1898 because I really like that year. And I'm going to take a hypothetical Mr. Smith who's dying at home, and he's going to be dying of consumption, which was the leading cause of death, tuberculosis. And he has been getting gradually weaker and sicker, and everybody knows what's going to happen because with tuberculosis, there was no hope. There were things people could try. They could go to desert climate, higher, cooler, drier air, but eventually it's going to happen. And what you would assume would happen is everybody sees the signs approaching, that they would all get really busy because death was incredibly, the burial of the body was incredibly labor intensive. So you'd think someone would build a coffin and sew a burial garment and dig a grave, and they did not. Everything was taboo until the person died. And at the moment of death, then all of these terribly labor intensive jobs had to be performed simultaneously. So with our hypothetical Mr. Smith, who's dying at home, his family is going to take care of him as long as possible. But there will reach a point where he will need help through the night. And at this point, the family is exhausted, and they are not going to be able to sit up with him and give him care while maintaining the farm and whatever else they're doing. And at this point, our story begins with sitting up, or in the vernacular, setting up, because the neighbors will either initiate it or the family will ask. And now setting up begins as the neighbors come in night after night to sit and stay awake, or as awake as they can manage, to be near Mr. Smith as he's dying. Now, you would think, well, okay, they're nursing him and they're keeping wood on the fire and they have basic jobs to do. But what surprised me were the things that they had to do that really aren't obvious. And the first is they're there to give him his medicine. Now, what's so hard about that? Can't Mr. Smith give himself his own medicine? Well, in this day and age, doctors compounded their own drugs, their own medicines, and they would make house calls and they would bring the various drugs, and then they would put them in bottles and add a little this, a little that, and add some liquid and shake it up. And then they would tell the family this quantity, this interval, and so forth. And the trouble is that, one, they reused their bottles, things weren't labeled, and these concoctions contain some very dangerous elements. They used strychnine medicinally, they used arsenic, and they used mercury. And any of that taken in too large a quantity would make things a lot worse if it didn't actually cause the person to die a lot sooner. So the neighbors had to keep track of the medications and be awake enough to know what to give him and when. Now, as death gets closer, they're also there to hear his last words. Well, they're there to make sure the family doesn't miss the death. There was a taboo, a stigma about dying alone. So much so that if a newspaper reported by mistake that someone died alone, family would be furious. One of my favorite stories is that 1891, Benton County Democrat reported the widow Martin died alone. It's a weekly paper. The following week, they run a retraction. They say, we made a little error. The widow's son-in-law, Mr. Barney, came, I assume, boiling into their office and demanded an apology. And so the newspaper editor wrote, because a person dies suddenly and alone, it does not follow that the person was mistreated. We know of many such cases where the best of care was given to the one who died thus. We regret that our notice was read between the lines and thus construed as we were perfectly innocent of meaning any such stuff. But Mr. Barney took offense to feel offended because he said it was misleading, causing people to believe that the lady was neglected. And so the apology was, not great. But the fact is, dying alone was considered tragic. And that is why during the Civil War, when men go off to battle and they die alone, it was bad enough that you lost them, but to know they died alone was it just added to the trauma. And there are stories of men dying holding family photographs. So in a sense, they could be with their family at the end. It was very important. But so were their last words. Now, I cut and pasted all of this off of tombstones. And this is just a fraction of the last words that I have found. The last words are so important that families paid extra to have them put on tombstones. Now, the number one thing the dying person says is, meet me in heaven. Live a good life, meet me on the other side so we can be together again. This is terribly traumatic. You're saying goodbye, you want to be sure your loved ones will be with you. But what's funny is that I have got accounts of men who are about to be hanged for murder, axe murdering their wives and children, their traveling companions. And they're on the scaffold, allowed to say their last words. And what are their last words? Meet me in heaven. I know where I'm going, but I'm not so sure about the rest of you. Live good lives and you can see me again, which is weird because here these people are there just as audience members. But meeting on the other side was tremendously important. However, every so often the person is dying and they say something wonderful. Of course, they don't know what's their last words. And when you get that, oh my goodness, giving advice. This is one of my favorite examples. Mary Borland dies saying, live in and take care of our old home that I loved and where we lived together happy. You do not want to live with young folks. Her husband died a few years later. He doesn't have a headstone. I don't think he lived with young folks. I don't know, but I love Mary Borland. Another one that I love is John Simmy Evans. His last moments, he called his brothers to him, told them to shun bad company and the dance. Well, the odd thing about John Simmy Evans, actually his last words go on. I cropped them out, but he says to his mother, I will see you at the judgment. And his mother was dead, so he's talking to his stepmother. I'll see you at the judgment. Now, a lot of times when families like dying words and put them on tombstones, they will do it more than once. I have found husband and wife with matching dying words, or families who have it several times. John's sister died a few years after he did. I would show you her stone, but it's very damaged. Her stone says on it, Brother John. Apparently, she's seeing a vision as she dies. Brother John, in a dream, I saw you come to me. Stretch out your hand, and I stretched mine to you, and the stone is broken right there. I don't know what happened next. I have looked for that stone. I don't know what happened next. But she saw her brother, I think, come together. And all that's on her stone right next to his. So dying words sometimes are comforting. The Reverend Alexander Stevenson in 1871 died saying, this can't be death. I feel too good. And occasionally the dying person speaks in verse, which really says to me that their relatives wrote it down and then rhymed it. Because one of my favorites was the wife of a tombstone carver. And she supposedly died saying, my beloved little children, take heed to what I say, for I am on my dying bed and soon must pass away. And it goes on about do your duty. If you to me in future years, your love for me would tell, always do your duty and do it well or something. It was, and then she also rhymes her dying husband about what a great husband he has been, which was so not true. I know that man, he is a rotter. But anyway, he got to put her last words because he carved her stone. So our hypothetical Mr. Smith has reached the point of death. He has died. The neighbors were there to wake up the family so they could be present. That was important, to hear the dying words. In fact, the folklore collectors, Vance Randolphs and Otto Rayburn, who collected in the Ozarks, said that people would give messages to the dying to take to family members who already died. I've only found one obituary that mentions that, but the idea being as Mr. Smith is dying, he might be able to take messages with him. So you want to be present at the death, and the family being asleep can be awakened by the ones who are setting up. Now, as I said, as Mr. Smith breathes out his last, everyone in that room has got to immediately go to work. There is so much to do. And in the Ozarks, pre-embalming, the norm was to get that person in the ground within about 24 hours. You don't know how long they will stay in rigor mortis. You don't really know when decomposition is going to begin. You don't know what the weather's going to do. Because if the weather turned and you had a hellacious snowstorm and the ground freezes solid and you can't get that body in the ground, the neighbors will have to go on sitting up. You do not leave a body unattended when it's above ground. And there are cases of somebody saying, oh, let's delay, the burial until someone can be here. The weather changed and neighbors sat up for over a month for the body till they could get it buried. You don't want to risk that. Your neighbors have put their lives on hold to be there for you. So the first thing you have to do is get the body laid out. Because as I said, ambient temperature, body chemistry, size, weight, age, cause of death can all play a part in when they go into rigor mortis. And you've got to get them positioned so they'll fit into a coffin before that happens. So imagine the old rope beds of the Ozarks. It's a frame, a piece of rope stretched back and forth, and then a big bag filled with feathers or corn shucks or hay, called a tick. And that body, if it was left on the bed, is going to contort to the shape of the mattress, and then it won't fit into a coffin. By the way, I should just stop here and say there will be pictures of dead people in their coffins. You've been warned. Now I tell you. So the first thing is to get the body off of the bed and get it washed, dressed, positioned, and then it's ready to be buried into its coffin. But the coffin won't be there because that's a lot of work too. So I'm going to use this picture of Mary Watkins. This is in Mount Holly. Mary Watkins was a 16-year-old girl, and she is being pulled up out of the grave by an angel. And the angel is showing her where he's taking her, fair enough. But Mary is in the pose of a laid out body. She has a winding sheet wrapped around her, and her arms are crossed on her chest. It's traditional. Often there would be something put in the family Bible, a toy if it's a child, a rose, and so forth. But Mary has the winding sheet. She's laid out, but her eyes are open because, as I said, the angel is showing her where he's taking her. This statue grouping is found in other places. It's the only one I know of in the Ozarks, and I believe that is a portrait of Mary because these other statue groupings have different faces. She was, I think, 18 years old. She was a very wealthy orphan when she died. So Mary has been laid out. Now, early undertakers use something called a cooling board. Families would take a door off of its hinges, some planks up out of a floor, or had some boards that they would put on sawhorses or 2 chairs and make a sturdy, flat platform to put the body on. I'm showing you this one though. A cooling board was a little device. It folded up like a suitcase. So this has been popped open. This is in Harrison in their museum. And I was mystified by that thing on the end, which I discovered would swing out and lock into place on both ends. And I know the holes were there for ventilation, but what were those devices? And luckily, I found this picture. That is the Gleason cooling board, and presumably that's Mr. Gleason demonstrating its use. So once a body has been positioned and dressed, you can put a sheet over it to protect it, and those uprights would aid in that. And sometimes undertakers would loan cooling boards to families or bring them to the home so a body could be prepared. Part of this business of getting the body ready is you had to wash it. And there doesn't seem to be much taboo against who does what. Men or women could wash children. Usually women washed women, men washed men, but not always. And Vance Randolph has this to say: the hill folk have a veritable mania for washing dead bodies. The moment a death occurs, the neighbors strip the corpse and scrub it vigorously. A man may be dirty all his life, and in his last illness, his body and bedding may be so foul that one can hardly stay in the cabin, but he goes to his grave clean so far as soap and water can cleanse him. So you have to get them washed, you have to get them dressed, and getting them dressed was kind of interesting. Most people, older people would set aside a burial garment. An older person would say, that's the dress I want to be put away in. Or a man wants to be buried in his cleanest, newest pair of bib overalls. But if you were going to make them, and in some communities you made a brand new outfit from scratch after the death occurred, you would generally make a shroud, and a shroud likened to a choir robe. It's a loose gown with big sleeves that you could slip on them very easily. And what I like about this carving is that the hand on the left is wearing a shroud. When you find clasping hands, the hand on the left side will almost always have stiff fingers. That's the dead hand. That is the hand that is in the coffin, and the living are saying goodbye. We'll take no more the parting hand and meet thee in the promised land. Touching the body one last time, taking their hand one last time was part of the mourning, the burial process. So in this case, the hand on the left has that loose sleeve, that shroud sleeve on it. But and we don't really know what shrouds look like because it's so thick they get buried. but I love this one because it may not be traditional, but it was made by a woman, Mrs. Jo Wilkinson, in the late 1860s for burial. She had a swelling on her leg, and doctors were planning to amputate. I think she was about 16 years old, and she did not think she would survive the amputation. So she made this gown, this dress, to be buried in. It has covered in eyelet embroidery that she made, pearl buttons, handmade lace. I kind of picture her saying, "You can't amputate my leg. I haven't finished my dress yet," as she added more embroidery. But in fact, she did survive the amputation. She married, she had children. And when she died in Arkansas, we don't really know where the gown was made. It might have been made in Kentucky. But when she died, her grandchildren gave this to the museum. She was too stout by then to fit into the dress, and styles had changed. So her grandchildren donated it, and they took it out of storage for me. It's very hard to photograph white on white, but you can see the embroidery, the pearl buttons, the shell buttons, and it's absolutely lovely. So that would be an example of a shroud, made for this woman's own use. Sitting up with the body. Once the body has been washed, dressed, positioned, hands folded, eyes closed, usually with coins, weighting the eyelids. You don't need to leave the coins there for very long. Once the eyes stay closed, you can remove the coins. Families kept those coins for reuse. They were almost like sacred relics. You kept the quarters or the large pennies or nickels or whatever you use on those eyes, you would save them. So this is a man sitting with his wife. She's been obviously prepared for burial. Very wealthy family. This was about the 1920s, they believe, and their floral arrangements. Now the next part of the process begins, and that's sitting up with the body. You never leave a body. There are stories of children on their way home from school, passing a home where there's just been a death, and kids have been brought in to sit by the body while the family went and got neighbors to make arrangements or find a funeral home undertaker. You do not leave the body alone. I want to say that's a taboo. It's just not done. At the same time, the folklore collectors over and over again collected this idea that some unspeakable calamity will happen to a body if a cat gets near it. It's a period of time before there were screens on windows, but the fear of cats seems to be the number one reason you have to stay near it, at least in the beginning. Charles Dickens in Bleak House even has a reference. Bleak House was written in 1852 in England about a surgeon leaving the scene of a death, or a doctor saying, "Oh, don't forget, there's a cat under the bed, get that out of here." It was believed a cat would climb up from the corpse and chew any part that was cartilage, so nose, ears, and so forth, and disfigure the body, and then you would have a terrible time at the viewing. There were students at the University of Arkansas who collected folklore, and I don't have a date on this, I'm sorry, probably the 1950s. A young man named Charles Brinkley in Mark Tree, Arkansas, went back to visit his roommate and interviewed his roommate's grandfather. I'm not sure if the dates actually work out, but supposedly the grandfather was in the Civil War. And he went with 11 other men on a burial party, and 10 of them dug graves for their fallen buddies, and 2 had to stand over the bodies and fight off thousands of cats which were trying to carry off. He never did like cats after that, the grandfather. But for whatever reason, cats or flies or any type of vermin or any type of animals that might try to get in, you stayed with the body overnight. And at night, a lot of times couples would sit up, courting couples, husbands and wives, sometimes it would be all men, and had been a member of fraternal lodge. His lodge brothers might sit up all night. Sometimes the body might be taken to a lodge hall. Generally, though, it's in the home. And the point, of course, is to keep it on those boards, to keep it cool, to keep damp claws on the face and hands for fear that the skin would discolor. There are all sorts of substances that were used to put on the body to keep the skin clear, supposedly. And sitting up takes place, everyone stays awake. Now, you might doze a little when the person is dying, but you stay awake when there's a body. And the story is that everything was respectful and hushed tones till midnight. And after midnight, the horse trading began. That's when people started maybe doing a little drinking. But meanwhile, everyone is waiting for the coffin, because the men holding the coffin have a lot of work. And if our hypothetical Mr. Smith died in the afternoon, those men are going to work through the night the coffin built. Yes, you can buy one at a general store. No, you don't want that because they are believed to be shoddy, and you wouldn't risk that if you didn't have to. I should just mention a few things that people did in addition to the setting up. Neighbors were scrubbing the house, taking the bed apart, hauling things into the yard, doing the laundry. And when you do the laundry of a dead person, you take their feather pillow and you rip it apart and you look for a crown, because a feather crown is proof positive that their soul has made it to heaven. Feather crowns were treated very seriously. They figure in obituaries. Women buried with their husband's feather crown. They're treated like relics, kept in a box for the obituary. A feather crown, if you were to pluck your own chickens and geese, the feathers will pack up in a pillow over time, and the pointy, the quill end, will start to work its way into the middle of the ball, and the plume end will be on the outside, almost like a spiral. And these things can be the size of, and they work their way up the size of a baseball, I guess. There are stories of people tearing pillows apart when someone is sick and destroying any crowns they find to try and keep the person longer. There's one very sad story of a little boy who asked his mother, "Mom, what happened to Daddy's feather crown?" And the mother says, "I was afraid to look," because the husband had lived such a terrible life. If there had been no crown, that would have been obviously, you wouldn't expect to find a crown, and she didn't try to find one. There are stories of miracles where they didn't find the crown, and when they put the feathers back in the pillow, there was the crown. So these things were, as I said, treated very, very seriously. Another thing people did as a part of the mourning process ahead of the funeral, and that would be to take post-mortem photography. In some cases, as with the baby, it's the only picture you have of your child. In the case of an adult, this is, I think it's John Haney in Madison County. His son was away in World War I and would never see his father again. So they had a picture taken of him in his casket so that the son would be able to have seen his father one last time. So the taking of a postmortem photograph, if you had access to a camera, was very important. This isn't in the Ozarks. This is over near Monticello, Arkansas. And it's, I guess, basically a grave house. It's a structure. It's not a mausoleum. It's on top of 3 graves for the, I forget the family's name. It's on that at the top, Tilghman. And the Tilghmans apparently set a great store by postmortem photography, because here they all are. Each grave has got 2 photos. One says in life and one says at rest. And in life was obviously them alive, and at rest. And the mother and daughter on the right side died about 2 days apart. And it's quite possible they had one funeral for both of them. So clearly they had identical caskets, and the picket fence is the same in the back. I cannot find out what happened to them. But in any event, taking a picture at the end was, if you could, was a very important part of the process. So was saving a lock of hair, which is why we have hair jewelry you can find in antique stores, where you could send off a lock of hair and it would be braided into an intricate pattern and put into a locket or a pin or a ring or a watch fob, and another type of memento to save. People loved looking at bodies. I should just say that the famous dead, Henry Starr was a bank robber. He was the nephew of Belle Starr, and he made quite a career out of robbing banks. He would rob a bank, he'd get caught, he'd go to prison, he'd get religion in prison, the governor would pardon him, he'd get out, he'd rob a bank, lather, rinse, repeat. He did this a bunch of times. And finally, in Harrison, he went too far, and one of the bank tellers had a gun under the counter and killed him. And I'm showing you this picture because until his family came from Oklahoma to get him, everyone in town wanted to see the body. So he was laid out, and that is the front window of the undertaker's establishment, R.D. Klein, because you can see an open casket on the other side of that wall glass behind him. They put him in the window, the showroom window, so everybody in town could get a good look. People were not squeamish in those days. So Mr. Smith is now laid out on boards in the living room. People are sitting up with him, and now we have to build the box he's going to be put away in. So the question is, where do you get a coffin? As I said, general stores sold them, but people believed that they were on the flimsy side. And what you didn't want to risk was having the bottom fall out or having the thing deteriorate and the grave sinking any faster than it should. People were very particular. You bought a coffin if there was nobody to build you one, or if there was like an epidemic or an emergency, and you had to bury in a hurry. But that said, stores did sell them. So coffins versus caskets, there was a difference. Now, I have gotten into a little Facebook spat occasionally over the difference, and everybody has their different beliefs. And most people believe that if it is a hexagonal box, it's a coffin, and if it's got one lid, or if it's a rectangular box, it's a casket, and if it's a hexagonal box with a tapering toward the feet, coffin. And that is what I guess most people use. However, I interviewed a third generation of undertaker who was an elderly man. He learned from his father when this man was a little boy going out on death calls, and then his grandfather had been the first undertaker in this town. And he told me that the difference has nothing to do with the shape of the box. It has everything to do with the lid. If the lid is separate and freestanding, it is a coffin. And if it is attached to the back of the box with a hinge and lifts back, it is a casket. And of course, you have a rectangular box and it's hinged. You really couldn't hinge a coffin lid in that shape. It would be difficult to do. But he maintains that that is the technical difference between coffin and casket. So this is in a local museum, all different ways to build them. Here's a picture. This was taken somewhere in the Ozarks. This is Townsend Godse's book, Ozark Mountain Folk. These were the last. The only time I've ever seen pictures of a coffin being built. And look at how many people are involved. Again, all of the neighbors all pitched in to do all this work. So even though one man might be the carpenter, he still needs someone to hold the lantern and I guess hand him nails or give him advice, because everyone is there involved in some way. And the women will then, oops, I jumped ahead of myself. The women will be involved in lining that coffin. And lining a coffin was kind of tricky. You made like a fitted piece of fabric, and then you tacked along the edge, and then you hid the tacks with pieces of lace. So again, in the midst of everything else, somebody has to go to the store and buy yards and yards of fabric and lace and trim and fancy tacks. So how do you shape a hexagonal box where it's going to bend around the widest part of the body? Well, one method is kerfing. Now, this is an Oddfellows coffin used in the Kingston Oddfellows initiation ceremony, but it's a good example because somebody local built that box and they kerfed the edges. And that means scoring the wood in close together, and that will make it more pliable. And so you take a solid piece of wood, you score it, and then you either soak or steam the wood so it's flexible. And now you can bend it and nail it down to the back of the box. You have a much sturdier coffin than if you cut and mitered the corners. That's going to be harder to do and flimsier. And this is going to be one solid piece of wood bending on either side. So I think most coffins were kerfed. So they're the ladies lining again. And here are the Deary brothers who drowned on the same day. And I'm showing you their picture because you can see a difference in their coffin styles. Obviously, when you have two family members to bury, different groups of men are going to be making those coffins. And you can see that one is more rounded, one's more squared off. And you also see what a tight fit it is. There's not a lot of room to spare. And again, that's another reason for keeping the body flat, level, so it will fit into a coffin, because if there was any contortion, you would have a hard time fitting them in. Double coffin. This is extremely rare, but I do love showing this picture. This is in Madison County where I live. And I was given access to this, to Sog and Esther Eubanks. And the story was that Esther died of, I want to say malaria, and Sog couldn't live without her. And so he said to his children, don't dig a grave, don't do anything yet. And he lay down in his bed and he prayed to die, and he had a heart attack and he went. That is probably what happened, but a family member said to me, well, Sog never couldn't imagine life without Esther because she waited on him hand and foot. So I guess death was preferable. Maybe he felt stirrings and he knew he could do, I don't know. But in any event, the man standing behind them is supposed to be the man who built the double coffin. So he'd never built one before. And as you can see, and the photo of the two of them is on their tombstone. I also want to point out, and you can't really see in this picture, but there are handles on the sides of their coffin. And you cannot believe that any handles would bear that kind of weight. And they don't. Handles are not meant to, you do not carry a coffin by its handles. If you did, they would rip out. A swing bale like that would hurt your hand. They are merely decorative. And so even the Saganister with their double coffin have the handles, have the decorative hardware. If the family can afford the coffin set, a coffin plaque, the decorative screws, tacks, brads, handles, then you buy it. But it is just decoration. None of it is functional. Very rare to find pictures of people grave digging. And if you imagine digging a grave, at best 2 men can get down in the grave. There's 2 of them right there in that space. But look at how many men are helping. Apparently, when you dig a grave, everybody shows up because you go and take turns. It's hard work. If you hit rock, you might have to use dynamite. You might have to start over. So everybody shows up. They've all got advice on where to put the grave, so forth. This is Kingston, the town where I live. But I love that. And I'm told that is pretty much normal. Everybody showed up to dig the grave. Another picture from Madison County. As the grave is dug, you pile dirt up next to it. There's none of this trucking the dirt away to another part of the cemetery so no one sees it. I just went to a burial recently where all the dirt had been put in a dump truck and driven to the far side of the cemetery, as though the dirt was somehow offensive or a reminder to the family. In this day and age, as the dirt pile gets higher, fence rails or pieces of wood are being cross-stacked to hold the dirt back. And that way, when it's time to fill the grave, you simply pull the rails apart and start shoveling the dirt in. It's very efficient, but it is very, very visible. So the grave is directly under that coffin. There are planks running underneath it. Should just mention that, as I said, no one was spared. Children took part in every aspect of this. If it was a schoolmate, they served as pallbearers. They took a last look at their schoolmate. And there are some terrible stories of children who died in disease or burns or horrible accidents, and yet everyone takes a last look in that coffin before burial. Every one of those children is holding a floral arrangement, most likely picked from their front yards. There are wreaths, and there are children who I don't think they usually sat up. They would be brought to the home to sit up, and they would be allowed to sleep on a pallet, but children participated in all of this. Transporting the coffin to the cemetery. In our hypothetical story, the coffin will be delivered the next day, and the body will be placed in it, the lid will be put on, and now you have to transport. This picture in Berryville, Arkansas, this is pretty upscale. Having a designated or dedicated hearse, a matched pair of horses. Bart Atkinson actually had a general store and a livery stable. So he invested in a hearse, and that would have been a very upscale way to be conveyed to the grave. But those weren't terribly common in the Ozarks. More likely, if you had a wagon and a pair of mules, that would be a way. This was a World War I soldier whose body was brought back after the war. And so the flag is upside down. There's a glass hearse. His coffin is in there, and the boxes up on top are floral arrangement wreaths, and they're all people are processing to the cemetery for his burial. More likely, though, if you're in a rural community, you went to the grave in the back of a pickup truck. This man, that's his truck. That's his son. His son was the one who, as an older man, gave me these pictures. And they have carried Viola Hawkins. She was the woman we saw in the coffin at the beginning. Viola Hawkins has been brought to the cemetery. They have brought a couple of little ladder-back chairs, and they have rested the casket, the coffin, in her case, on top, piled on the flowers. And there's Myrtle, her daughter, being comforted by the women. And what's interesting here is that you're looking at a mowed section, but cemeteries weren't kept mowed. They were cleaned at decoration day, and that was it. So they've just stopped at the entrance to the cemetery, because when they carry Myrtle's coffin, Viola's coffin back to the grave, the brush will be pretty high, and the men will do that. But they're going to have their final part of the graveside ritual here in the cemetery. Sometimes it happened in the home. If your minister only made the rounds a couple times a year, you most likely had no minister, and you did a delayed funeral. But in this case, someone will show up with song with hymnals from the church. Someone will say a few prayers, and there will be a graveside ritual, starting with taking a last look. Myrtle, the daughter, is taking her last look at her mother. There's children everywhere. Women are sobbing. I was told that if people didn't cry hard enough, some of the older women in the crowd would pick it up a few notches. You wanted everybody crying. You wanted them grieving. That was considered healthy. There was no stigma about wailing. That was actually a good thing. So the women are now taking their last look at Viola. And now they're going to put the lid on. And this is what I say, the coffin hardware had no function whatsoever. Notice right here, well, let me just do this. Those are nails sticking up out of the lid. Now she's got decorative hardware all over the top of that coffin lid, including these beautiful little, they call thumb screws. And they'll hold the lid on for the trip to the cemetery, but they're just for show. You could do without them because somebody has started driving the nails ahead of time. And once that lid is on, someone will step forward with a hammer and finish driving the nails all the way in, which is very hard on the family, having to hear the pounding of the nails into the coffin, especially when it's a child. And there are many accounts of hearing that noise. I also call your attention to how many children are in this audience. All these little kids, all taking a last look, all participating. I think that was just considered good parenting. Kids went to funerals. There was a fear of being buried alive. You couldn't escape that. There are so many stories of people who may or may not have been buried. The persistent vegetative state wasn't well known. Even doctors couldn't always say for certain. There are stories of people who almost got buried alive. The strangest story I came across is that John Quincy Wolfe, he wrote a memoir. And when he was 12 years old, in 1876, he watched his mother being buried. And he wrote, "I went to the graveyard at the mouth of Moccasin Creek. When the lid of the coffin was moved, I saw drops of perspiration all over mother's forehead. And I heard people at the graveside question whether she was really dead or in a state of suspended animation. The burial proceeded, however." There's the coffin being carried. You see all the brush. The people were staying back at the entrance, and men are carrying the coffin to where the grave has been dug. Cemeteries were cleared and cleaned only once a year, and that was at Decoration Day. Different ones, different times. It was not always Memorial Day. And in rural communities, you tried to space them out because you had family buried lots of places. So you had to be able to attend more than one. One more, a different funeral. This is a child, obviously a child's burial. You see the cross-stacked rails behind holding the dirt. The coffin is, or in this case, I'm sorry, a casket in this case is on stretchers over the mouth of the grave. And there are straps because when it comes time to lower the box, men will either use reins or harness or rope, or in this case, sometimes undertakers had straps they loaned the family and they would lower. This is the baby's funeral, also in Kingston, with adult-sized hardware. And if you notice, the men are trying to lower it evenly, but they're already going a little crooked. And time and again, when you hear about a cemetery that's been dug up and moved, people will say, "Oh, there are bodies on their sides. It proves that they weren't dead when they were buried." They were on their sides because the body was stiff and rigor mortis. The coffin wasn't lowered evenly, and the least little tilting and the body is going to roll. So there's the stories of people being buried alive are probably, we hope, greatly exaggerated. But it's very hard for men with the weight of that coffin to get it down at a level pace. One thing in the Ozarks was scraping and mounding graves. You keep graves with piles of dirt forever. These are not graves that have not settled. These are graves, some of them going back so far, no one knows who's buried there. This cemetery practices scraping and mounding on all graves. So once a year, church members come in with fresh sand and gravel and they mound every grave. It's a memento mori, a reminder of death. It keeps every grave looking like a recent one, because when you have that fresh dirt pile, it's like saying you're still fresh in our memory. And also, speaking of the dirt pile, in the Ozarks, you did not leave the cemetery until every last spadeful of dirt was placed on the grave. It was taboo. If you left early, you or someone in your family could die. You didn't want to risk that. Scraping and mounding is sometimes practiced just on family plots. So the rest of the cemetery is mowed, or in this case, not mowed, but that family continues to pile fresh sand on their family graves. Sometimes the mounds are permanent. They're made out of concrete, but they look like piles of dirt. Decoration Day is like kind of the final part of the process. As I said, different communities had different days. And people would go in for a work day the day before and clean, remove brush, mow if they could, remound the graves, and then all year long, ladies would have been making crepe paper flowers to decorate. And I love this. A friend actually held a class on how she learned to make crepe paper flowers from her grandmother, and she taught a group of us how to make them. In fact, they were so popular. Well, here's another example of cabbage roses and chrysanthemums. But this idea of making flowers was so popular, there was actually a book that the Denison Paper Company gave away. If you go to the Berry County Museum website and look under, I think, the ephemera tab, you can find the entire book, and it shows you, has patterns for all the different types of flowers and tells you how to cut and fold crepe paper and how to form it into flowers, presumably originally for Decoration Day. I interviewed a lady who said that her grandmother spent all year long making flowers, and she decorated all graves. If she didn't even know when if somebody didn't have enough flowers, in her opinion, she would put paper flowers. And this lady said to me that her grandmother wasn't very good at it, but she was faithful to it. Another thing we find in the Ozarks are shells. I can't really explain it. Conch shells and mussel shells, and of course this is St. Louis and Carthage, but the conch shell either embedded on a grave or used as decoration. I find all the time remnants of shells. Monument companies that have put new markers and taken up old ones have found remnants of shells under markers. And I've even seen a letter from a woman writing to her aunt in Texas saying, please send me some of those pretty shells to put on my boy's grave. This woman lost 3 children very close together, and she's sending away for shells to put on their grave. Another type of memorialization, a child's grave, his picture, the family is meeting. I think this was probably taken at Decoration Day, but there was a photographer and they had a chance to take a family grouping, including their dead son. Well, this brings me to the end of my talk. As I said at the end of my first one, there's my email address. Please feel free to send me pictures, questions. I'll help you if I can. And you can help me because I am looking for the tombstones of amputated body parts. Sally's leg, Joe's arm. They are out there because when somebody had an arm or leg amputated, they wanted to know where it was, because phantom limb pain meant they would feel pain in the missing limb, and the only cure was to dig up that part and make it more comfortable. Very often the person is not buried near the limb. Time and again, they're not even in the same cemetery, or they're many rows apart. There really was no attempt to recombine them at death. You'd think, well, at the end, God will put everybody back together again. I can't explain it, but when I find limbs, tombstones are usually not near the person who lost that limb. So I'm looking for that, tombstones with the cause of death, especially ones that name murderers, Joe Smith killed by Bill Jones or whoever. If you find ones, I would love to have examples from my collections of tombstone pictures. So thank you all very much. We have time for a couple questions. Yes.
Was that common in the Ozarks, or was it just a different time period where?
So the question is, with a postmortem photo, taking a last picture of the deceased in their coffin, but you're seeing the household around them. Is that right? Well, really, the body is going to be kept in the home. So if there's any access to a photographer, or any chance of getting a picture, short of carrying them out into the yard in the sun and getting, it's more likely to find them in the home. Where I live, there was one person who owned a camera up through the Depression, and she's the one they called to take those pictures. She's a school teacher. She had a Brownie camera. And so I don't know that they meant to take the background, but it's charming to find that because you can see the wallpaper or the light fixture, or, I have seen ones where they carried the coffin outside for a picture, and then you might see a chicken running by. I mean, I think it's just up to the family and what the photographer, they didn't have flash capability. So it may have just been whatever the light allowed them to do. I wish I had an answer. Yes.
The difference between a cemetery and a graveyard.
That keeps making the rounds on Facebook, and a cemetery is a freestanding, the graveyard is attached to a church. I don't think that's really true in the Ozarks. I'm on like a little listserv with graveyard lovers and historians, and we're all in the South, and we've been debating this. One of them says that in Alabama, they only use the term burial ground. They don't use either. And other people have said it's interchangeable. And the problem is, I know of a lot of cemeteries where there used to be a church, but it burned down. So is it now a cemetery because it can't be called a graveyard because the church is gone? So I don't think that that's a hard and fast rule. It may be in some places. Yes. So the question is, if the family Bible is buried with grandma, what happens to the history? I really wonder if that's why there are mistakes on tombstones. In my earlier talk, I mentioned how many mistakes there are. I talked to a man who helped move a cemetery when he was a teenager. His job was digging, and he said the number one thing they found were Bibles. Now, the family maybe ripped that page out that had the births and deaths, we hope. But what if they didn't, and the grief and all the commotion of burying, they just put the Bible in grandma's hands and off it goes? I think a lot of information was lost. And of course, houses burn down and things go missing and get stolen and what have you. I think a lot of information was just people going on their memories. And of course, they didn't have access to the census to go back and check what somebody had said. I really mistrust a lot of what is out there as the true dates of something. Well, it's a good question. If it was her Bible, like she was given that when she joined a church and she kept the records, then obviously it would just be her going forward. I own a family Bible that was my grandmother's mother's, and it starts with my grandmother's mother. So yes, because if her mother had a Bible, it was either buried with her or some family member got it. So I suppose it does go back to the person who owned the Bible going forward, and that information could be lost if the family was literate and wrote in the Bible the births, the deaths, the marriages. Things could have disappeared that way. It's more of a guess, because by the time you move a cemetery, it's a little late. But someone should have examined those books. Yes. Ooh, excellent question. Are there specific Ozark funerary food traditions? Yes. People, and I should have actually mentioned that it was a very important part of the setting up for the neighbors to bring in food. Yes, you brought your best. You brought company food. So there's a thing in the Ozarks called a stack cake. You heard these are the thin layers of cake and then applesauce or dried fruit in between, and they can be really tall and they're enormously hard to make. And that's the kind of thing you hear people taking. Jars of preserves. Fried chicken. You don't take cabbage because the smell of cooked cabbage is too reminiscent of the smell of death. That's a taboo. But other than cabbage, I don't know of anything that you don't take. But mostly it's like your best. You give the corpse your best. People have given feather pillows or donated fabric for the lining, buying that coffin hardware. You're doing the best for them. You're doing the best for the family. So you are really bringing company food. There was a story of a woman who brought a jar of preserves to the family. And something happened and they said, do you want us to give the preserves back? And she said, no, you keep it. I don't remember what happened, why they didn't, that maybe they didn't feed mourners or something, but it's like the food is an important part of the process. So thank you for that. Yes.
So we need like very, very small church. Let's go say like 1918 in Williams. How did those traditions differ when bodies were dying at such a alarm?
That's a wonderful question. In an epidemic, what happens to the traditions? They cease. When everybody is sick, there is no one to come in and nurse the sick. And or smallpox would be another one. Something so contagious that people are so afraid of, you don't help the family. And that's huge, because when you go from everything being done for the family, where it's almost taboo for the family to help at all, to saying we'll leave firewood on your porch or we'll put food on your porch, but we won't come in, and people die inside with just their family members. And there are accounts of this, especially influenza or, as you said, an epidemic. Then it changes. Everything changes by the time undertakers start to convince people of the need for their services. But, and it's quite possible in an epidemic if there were professionals and you could pay them. But when everything is breaking down, then yes, none of these things can be followed. And there's even accounts of a family having to dig at their own grave or bury their own dead. And it was so unusual at the time that that gets handed down in the family as a family story, because otherwise it would not have happened. So that is a good point. There were epidemics, and it changed everything. Yes. Dying isolated. Yes. Well, yeah. Well, one time, of course, families a long way away could not have gotten back in time. If there was an undertaker, they might have the only phone in town or the only ability to send a telegram, and you might try, but then you've got to have embalming. That now we're getting outside of the home burial and the neighbors helping to the professionals embalming and providing services and bringing things into the home for the family. But yeah, we have come back around. You're right. And the tragedy of somebody dying alone without family nearby. Another question here.
Well, I realize that book was 1950, but since the population has changed so since 1950, have you done anything? And since we just passed the Day of the Dead, November the 2nd, have you done any new documentation about the Day of the Dead in our area?
I'm really, a Day of the Dead is not something I have found any evidence of in the Ozarks up until modern times. And I kind of used 1950 as a cutoff because it allowed me to go up to, no, I kind of moved.
Yeah, I have a question from the Zoom. Do we know if any locals continue some of these rituals or not when they ceased? My family has been here since the late 1800s and still does some of these, sitting with the dying, bathing, clothing them, etc.
So 35 years ago. When the wife died, her body was taken to the funeral home. But when the husband died, they embalmed him and brought him back. And they sat up with him all night. And in my community, I have seen the little remnants, like little vestigial remnants, a black wreath on the door when the banker died, a man who was conveyed to the grave, pulled by his mules in the back of a farm wagon, because it was his last request. The bathing of a body and dressing and sitting up, that's old school.
How much have Appalachian customs influenced local death practices?
The Appalachians. I think these things didn't start in Arkansas and Missouri, Ozarks. These things were brought here, especially the taboos, traditions, customs, sitting up, all that. These are all traceable back to other states. We didn't invent them here. So the direct line. All right. Well, thank you all.
Thank you, Abby.